Let's just mention something real quick. It might seem weird that the human being is so susceptible to traumatic brain injuries, but let's talk for a second just about Usain Bolt, fastest person on the planet at this point in time. And when he is running as fast as he can travel at about 37.5 kilometers an hour, which is pretty fast, right? And it is certainly much faster than the entire human population can even dream of running. That's as fast as a human being can run so far on their own mechanical abilities. The invention of automobiles, riding horses, motorcycles, snowmobiles, jet skis, four-wheelers, all this stuff is a relatively new invention in the time of being a human being. If you look at the calendar of Homo sapiens, this is a blink of an eye. It just happened, okay? All this to say that the human brain and body in general did not evolve to be traveling at speeds of 80 kilometers an hour. It's insane, okay? The average 400 series highway in Canada is a 100 kilometer an hour speed limit, or 110 kilometers an hour. Your brain was not meant to be subjected to the forces that are at play with an accident of 110 kilometers an hour. That's insane. Even 50 kilometers an hour is very, very, very fast, okay? And so we're going to talk about why that's so bad for your brain. Let's talk about some of the stuff that actually happens to your brain whenever you're in an accident. So let's just keep it simple and say a motor vehicle collision. So you're traveling at about 80 kilometers an hour. Let's say you're driving the speed limit. And the car in front of you slams on the brakes, and you're riding too closely like everybody does, and you strike their vehicle. Now, what's going to happen is your vehicle is going to hit theirs with about 80 kilometers an hour force. Or let's say 75 or 60, it doesn't matter. It's going to start to stop once it hits that other vehicle. Your body is going to be flung forward. In particular, your head is kind of a pendulum on your neck, and it's going to be flung forward with a significant amount of force. It's going to have to stop. Even if it hits your airbag, it's going to have to stop. Now, airbags are a good thing, and they definitely save lives, but they don't stop what's going to happen within your skull. So let's just say you even hit your airbag here, okay? Which is best case scenario for you. And airbags don't always go off, and they don't always work, and you're not always positioned appropriately to where your airbag is. Let's just say all that is perfect. Well, good, you hit an airbag. Good. That means you probably won't have a skull fracture, and that's a good thing. But still, what's going to happen is your brain is going to be launched forward. Remember, your brain is just free-floating in intracranial fluid. It's not attached to anything. I guess it's attached to your spinal cord, but it's not attached within your skull. Your brain will now hit the front of your skull. It will hit it with such force that it will actually bounce backwards and then hit the back of your skull, causing further injury. That's called a coup contre coup injury, and it happens in the front and back of your brain. It can also happen on the sides of your head, depending on the mechanism of injury. That's something that the human body is unable to do anything about. Safety mechanisms within cars, helmets, they help to prevent skull fractures, but there's not much they can do to stop this injury from happening. Here's another injury that is really difficult for us to mitigate with safety measures. Okay? So, a diffuse axonal injury. This can't be diagnosed as a paramedic. It's just something to be aware of. So, you could think of your brain as a series of wires, and that is essentially what it is, right? Axons, dendrites, all connected together. The axons would be kind of the insulated part of a wire, right? So you'd have your insulation and the copper underneath, and that would be kind of your axon with a myelin sheath on top of it. Your brain can be subjected to so much force, it can be moved like a coup contre coup back and forth with such force that the axons themselves quite literally tear apart, like a bunch of wires just ripping, and then there's no more connections. There is almost nothing that you can do to mitigate that effect. If the speed with which your brain stops moving is high enough, regardless of helmet, car, safety measures, those axons can still be torn apart. And then that injury is categorized as mild, moderate, severe. Severe being what people would say is brain dead. No way to predict this as a paramedic, but it is something that would contribute to increased intracranial pressure, because any damaged tissue is going to cause inflammation, and that's going to cause blood to leak out of the blood vessels, and it's going to cause an increase in intracranial pressure. So coup contre coup, diffuse axonal injury, and we haven't even talked about skull fractures yet, because those are really basic, but I mean, in terms of understanding what they are, they're pretty basic. There's either a linear skull fracture, a depressed skull fracture, which is exactly what you think of. It's like your skull crushed in, or an open vault fracture, which is when the brain tissue itself is open to the outside air. It's pretty obvious why these would cause an increase in intracranial pressure. There is bleeding happening within. There's bleeding from the actual bone, and then there's bleeding probably from the brain tissue just underneath it. Diffuse axonal injury, we kind of talked about it. It would cause an increase in ICP due to hypoxia and inflammation. And then coup contre coup probably would cause bleeding, right? So the brain tissue that struck the front of the skull and the brain tissue that struck the back of the skull would probably be bruised, and there would be inflammation and bleeding in that spot. So all of these things can cause increased intracranial pressure. And the one thing you want to think about with traumatic brain injuries is mechanism of injury is the greatest predictor of what likely happened to them. And when you're talking about mechanism of injury or the kinematics of injury, the single greatest factor is, again, speed. That's really what matters the most. Motorcycle, horse, car, truck, oh, I was in an SUV. Really, it all comes down to speed. How fast were you physically moving whenever your body was abruptly stopped? Because the higher the speed, the greater the chance of serious injury or death. And something you should keep in mind when you're talking about the pathology we're about to talk about is the pathophysiology that happens after a traumatic brain injury, that increased intracranial pressure, would be the exact same as a hemorrhagic stroke. How we got to that pathology is different. Hemorrhagic stroke can happen spontaneously. It doesn't have to have anything to do with trauma. But at the end of the day, it's the exact same pathophysiological reaction. Common mechanism of injuries based on age, 0 to 5 is falls. So that's actually parents dropping kids, right? Diffuse axonal injury is shaken baby syndrome. I'm sure you've heard of that. So the actual pathology behind shaken baby syndrome is diffuse axonal injury. You shake the baby with such force that the mechanical axons there is mechanical shearing of the axons. It's crazy. Age 5 to 19, sports and recreation. So ice hockey, ATV, horseback riding in females. 20 to 39, assault is pretty prevalent with MVCs. Ages 40 and up, falls become a serious problem. And then 65 and up, we kind of already mentioned that. Falls are now associated with a severe risk of TBI. And that actually could just be a fall from standing at this point. The brain shrinks as we get older, and it creates more room within the cranial vault for more movement of the brain matter. So let's kind of visualize a basic idea of this happening. Okay, so we'll keep the example basic. So guy hits tree with car, and his head hits the windshield. And he has likely a linear skull fracture in the front of his skull. So let's say that that's what happened. So he has a skull fracture up here. And the bone is actually fractured. So what happens when the bone is fractured? Well, blood floods to that area in an effort to, 1, clot, and 2, repair tissue. But inevitably, some of that blood is going to leak, and it'll leak within the cranial vault, right? So it'll start taking up space within, right? And that's normal physiological reaction to any insult or injury. The problem is now we have put an extra material into that cranial vault. And remember, we said the cranial vault doesn't do well with that. It is used to having a certain amount of intracranial fluid, a certain amount of blood, a certain amount of brain tissue. And now we have this excess blood that was not meant to be there in the first place. Why is that bad? Again, the cranial vault cannot expand. It is not possible. So that means that the pressure within the vault, that is usually 7.5 to 15, is going to rise as a result of this bleeding within the skull, bleeding within the cranial vault. All right, so if our ICP has increased, well then what does that mean for our ability to perfuse the brain? So if we go back to it, right, CPP equals MAP minus ICP. And we don't really even need to know what the ICP went up to, but it went up, right? That means the difference between MAP and ICP is going to be smaller. And now your CPP will have lowered. No matter what, that's what's going to happen, right? So now the pressure in the skull is, let's say, 30, and your arterial pressure has not changed, your mean arterial pressure, so the difference is smaller and less blood is getting to the brain. That's really important to note. The moment there's an insult or injury and there's bleeding within the skull, or inflammation within the skull, or hypoxia within the skull, all of that is going to lead to an increase in intracranial pressure, and an increase in intracranial pressure is going to lead to a decrease in cerebral perfusion pressure. We talked about this. The brain can't handle that. It cannot handle a lack of oxygen. Okay, and it's probably also lacking oxygen, don't forget, because blood vessels are certainly damaged in this entire area. So there's probably a whole area of brain here that is ischemic, not even because of intracranial pressure, just because of the underlying injuries to the tissues. So they're going to become inflamed, they're going to become hypoxic, and the cells are going to swell. So not a good situation. What can we do about that decreased CPP? Can we do anything? What can the body do to increase cerebral perfusion pressure? Well, what is cerebral perfusion pressure again? Right? It's mean arterial pressure minus intracranial pressure, and we know that. So can the body increase mean arterial pressure? It can, and that is exactly what it's going to try to do. It is just a normal physiological reaction to an increase in ICP. The body will say, oh man, okay, we're not getting as much blood into the brain as we'd like. Let's increase mean arterial pressure. So the body does that. And let's say your mean arterial pressure is now 110. And your ICP has risen to 40, right? So now your cerebral perfusion pressure is 70. And that is acceptable. And now we're happy because now blood is getting to the brain and it is being perfused. Well, what is the problem with this? And let's think about it logically. What's going to happen? Keep in mind, this guy has a linear skull fracture and has had an amount of bleeding to that area. And that increase in blood within the cranial vault has caused the initial increase in ICP to begin with. Well, what's going to happen now that we force even more blood into the skull? So now we're forcing it with much higher pressure than we were before. You might have already kind of come to this conclusion, but what's going to happen is you're going to get significantly more bleeding from that area. It's not going to get any better. So now you're going to bleed even more, and it's going to occupy even more space, right? And once that bleeding occurs and it occupies even more space, what's going to happen? Well, your intracranial pressure is going to rise again because now there's even more blood in that fixed vault that we can do nothing about. So what you get is, over and over again, you have a bunch of bleeding in this area, intracranial pressure rises. In an effort to compensate, the body increases MAP. And that works for a short period of time. But the problem is, as soon as you increase that MAP, there's even more bleeding. And then once there's more bleeding, there's more intracranial pressure. That loop does not stop at all outside of a hospital with a land ambulance. There is nothing you can do to stop that from happening. It will continue to get worse and worse and worse. And your brain has nowhere to go except for that foramen magnum we mentioned earlier. That's the only hole in the entire skull, which is where your spinal cord comes out of, right down here. And what is going to happen is, since that's the only hole, there will be so much pressure within your skull, so much unbelievably high amounts of pressure, that it's going to push down on the brain. And that brain is going to be crushed through the base of your skull. That is actually what happens to you. Your brain becomes crushed through the base of your skull. It's called herniation of the brain. So herniation just means an organ or tissue moving outside of its regular spot. So when the brain begins to herniate, it moves outside of its regular spot, and it starts to be pushed down the foramen magnum, and that has profoundly negative effects on your brain. But since your brain controls your entire body, it has profoundly negative effects on your body. So join me for part 3 on this to finish up what this means for you as a paramedic, how it actually impacts your provincial treatments here in Ontario, generally speaking anywhere, and subscribe to Paramedic Prep Program for more videos.